again, Year 11, and welcome to week 9 of our History Revision programme. This week we're going to be continuing with our Germany topic of Weimar Germany, and we're going to be continuing to look at exam practice over the next 2 lessons before we attempt a full exam. This first lesson is going to be looking at the technique needed for question 4 and question 5. We're going to start off with the question 4 technique, which is always a describe question. Now this one I really like. It's only a 4 marker and it's a really simple question. Basically, the examiner will ask you to describe 2 points about something. And because it's a 4 marker, you will need to add specific examples and detail, but you don't need to write loads because of course it is only a 5-minute job as it's a 4-mark answer. Now this can be done as 1 paragraph. It could be done as 2 smaller ones if you wish, but actually it can be done as 1. You just need to make sure as well that you do also link back to the question within this answer too. Let's go on to look at some examples. So here is our first example of a question 4. Describe 2 weaknesses in the Weimar Constitution. So first of all, I'd like to pause this video for just a second so that you can think about what you would put as your 2 points if you were to answer this question. Okay, so you should have had a good think about that. I'm hoping that you came up with similar points to what I have done. So my 2 points would be proportional representation and Article 48. You may have also wanted to attempt to talk about things like Weimar being built on shaky foundations, but I just think that these 2 arguments are ones that you can actually have a little bit more detail about, and I do think there's some really strong arguments that these were weaknesses of the constitution of this new government. So we're going to basically look at a model answer for this question, in which I will explain how proportional representation and Article 48 were weaknesses within the Weimar Constitution. Let's go on and read this together. Okay, so we're now going to have a look at the model answer for that question. Describe 2 weaknesses in the Weimar Constitution. Now remember, I mentioned that we were going to do our point 1 about proportional representation and point 2 about Article 48. You will notice that I have broken this down into 2 smaller paragraphs. I think it just fits nicer with this question. So in terms of the question then, let me just read through the answer and then we'll talk about why this is a good answer. So the Weimar Constitution was modern and fair, but it had a number of underlying problems. The proportional representation voting system resulted in many parties and chaotic coalition governments. Governments found it hard to pass laws and make agreements. Elections were held frequently as coalitions broke down. This created the situation which led to Hindenburg and Papen asking Hitler to be Chancellor in 1933. In addition to this, Article 48 gave the President the right to rule by decree in an emergency. Hitler would use this to establish a dictatorship in 1933. And finally, all of the judges and officials came from the Kaiser's time, and they hated this new republic. They openly supported the right-wing rebels and terrorists, letting them off with light sentences, notably Hitler in 1923. Now, first of all, guys, it's clear that obviously we've got 2 solid points here. To be honest, you could even argue that there's a 3rd point at the end where we talk about the idea of the judges and officials kind of coming from the Kaiser's time and hating this new republic. But I think the 2 main points that have come across here is the fact that proportional representation, which remember is percentage of votes equals percentage of seats, was a real issue in Germany because of course it was a very fair voting system because every vote counted, but it was extremely difficult for the government to get a majority, and what that led to is a lot of chaotic coalition governments. That's been made really clear within this answer. It's talked about the fact that there are underlying issues with proportional representation where basically it creates a lot of chaotic coalition governments. And because of these coalitions, we've explained as well that the governments therefore found it hard to pass laws and make agreements, because if you've got coalitions that don't really have the same beliefs and values, they're going to take longer to discuss what their next steps are going to be, particularly in a time of crisis. We can also think about the fact that there's another reason here for why the proportional representation system was flawed, and that's because the fact that it led to coalitions also meant that the coalitions broke down because, as we just mentioned, they struggled to actually work together, and that led to frequent elections, more frequent than really was necessary. And what that then meant was that basically people had kind of lost faith in this new government, and eventually we know that Hitler managed to get into power in 1933. So the second point is about Article 48. Now let's not forget, of course, this gives the President the right to rule by decree. This was a really important point because, of course, it undermined democracy from the very beginning, and the fact that actually, in a way, this allowed Hitler to basically create a dictatorship from 1933, and we've got to think about the fact that these emergency powers are what enabled him to do that. So that is a really important point for why it was a weakness in the government. And then obviously we've also mentioned the fact that the government judges and officials were also right-wing, and of course that is one of the reasons again that people like Hitler got off with light sentences when they actually committed treason. So that's basically an answer to a 4 marker. You might word it slightly differently, but ultimately as long as you've got the 2 points in there, that's absolutely fine. As long as you're given reasons for why that caused a weakness for Weimar, that's the main thing. You'll have noticed in this answer, we've not just described what proportional representation is, we've not just described what Article 48 is, we've talked about why they were a problem and why they led to weaknesses in the government. That is something you've got to make sure that you do in this question. I think the question 4 style questions are really nice, and we've had a look at one example together, but now I'd like you to have a go at doing one on your own. Here's the question. Describe 2 economic problems faced by Germany from 1919 to 1923. So first of all, before we go over how I would answer this question, I want you to pause the video just for a second and think about what your points would be if you were going to answer this question right now. It's really good if you have a think about it yourself before we do go through some key points that I would mention. Pause the video now to have a think. Okay, so if I was going to answer this question, I would talk about these 2 points. War, debt and reparations would be point 1, so that'd be the first economic issue. And then the second one would be invasion of the Ruhr and hyperinflation. Now, for me, I know that some of you might have talked about hyperinflation and the Ruhr separately, but I personally think that they're quite well suited together because, of course, the invasion of the Ruhr kind of causes hyperinflation. So I think in that sense, if you do it like this, you're covering all areas then, and the examiner can't really pick you up for not adding enough examples. So I think that war, debt and reparations are kind of one economic problem that the government has to deal with in Germany, and the second problem is the invasion of the Ruhr and of course hyperinflation, which links with that. Don't forget that you can obviously talk about how war, debt and reparations actually affects the government, so why it's a problem, and also talk about why the invasion of the Ruhr and hyperinflation was a problem for the government as well. And you don't need to write in loads of depth though, guys, because it is only a 4 marker. This is meant to be a 5-minute job. So don't spend ages and don't go into too much detail as you would if it was an 8-mark question. But what I would like to do is just give some examples of war debt, like use some facts and figures just to show off in there. So use an example of like how much war debt was Germany in, how much reparations were they expected to pay, why would this be a problem? Talk about the invasion of the Ruhr, 60,000 French and Belgian troops invading the Ruhr, talk a bit about what happened there with the strike, and then again give some examples of the impact of hyperinflation and again why it was a problem for the government. So it's about kind of being really concise but also adding in some really good specific detail as well. So have a go, guys, and please hand in your answers to your teachers so that you can get some feedback. Well done if you've had a go at the 4-marker question. We're going to move now on to the question 5 technique. This question is worth 8 marks, and it always starts with in what ways. That's why I've called it the in what ways question. So it will often ask you in what ways was something a problem, or in what ways was did something change people's lives, or it can be a range of different things that it asks you, but it will always start with that. This question should essentially take you 10 to 12 minutes to answer. So essentially, you're going to need to write a bit more detail than you have done for a 4-marker because it's double the marks. So if, for example, you were asked about in what ways did the economic problems affect Germany, you'd have to do the same kind of points that you just did in the 4-marker, but add more depth and detail and explanation about how it affected Germany. That would be really important for this question because you could actually flip that same question we just done as a 4-marker into an 8-marker. For this question, you will also need 2 to 3 paragraphs. Now, this is really important because sometimes you will look at the question and you'll think, I can't think of more than 2 points. That's fine. Do it as 2 paragraphs. But sometimes you'll look at the question and you'll think, I can't do that in less than 3. Like, there's definitely 3 points I need to talk about. Then, of course, you do it in 3 paragraphs. But what I'm trying to say is it depends on the question. So we always recommend 2 to 3 paragraphs. And you must ensure that your paragraphs are focused on the question as well. If you're aiming for a grade 7 to 9, you also need to make sure that you're demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of historical concepts. So, for example, it might talk about in what ways did something change. So that's where you do need to address historical concepts like change and continuity. It might ask you about the importance of something, and so that's where you need to talk about significance. And so, like as an example, it might ask you about Hitler's policies towards women and how they changed over time due to the needs of the war economy. Obviously, that's not an example that we would use in Weimar, but when we do get onto Hitler's Germany, that is an example of how you could basically talk about how something changed over time. We're going to have a look at an 8-marker together, and again, I'm going to show you a model answer to show you how it kind of fits in practice. So let's go on to have a look at this together. Now that we've talked about how to answer question 5s, I want to give you an example and we'll look at this one together, and we'll also look at a model answer too. So the question is, in what ways was the stability of the Weimar Republic affected by right-wing political groups between 1919 and 1923? One of the key things here is that obviously we're looking at right-wing political groups. So pause the video again for a second and think about what your points would be before I talk through what I would say. Okay, so I'm hoping your paragraphs would be the same as mine. I would talk about Cat Putsch and Munich Putsch. Now, essentially, guys, what you've got to do for this question is you've got to give lots more detail because it is worth 8 marks. You've got to have a lot more detail than you would for a 4 marker. But you've got to basically talk about what happened in the Cat Putsch, give some details. Talk about what happened in the Munich Putsch, and again, give some details. But most importantly, to really get above 5 marks, you've got to make sure that you explain how these particular events affect the stability of the Weimar government. It's really important that you do that for both of these different examples. So you talk about the Cat Putsch, explain what happened, and then explain why it affected the stability of Weimar, and then describe the Munich Putsch and also explain why it affected Weimar. It's really important that you would make sure that you link back to the question, because ultimately that's what does get you those higher level marks. Let's go on and look at a model answer for this question together. Okay, so here's our model answer, and just before I begin reading, I'm just going to go over the question again. So it's, in what ways was the stability of the Weimar Republic affected by right-wing political groups between 1919 and 1923? I've already mentioned on the last slide that I'm going to be addressing this question with basically a paragraph about the Cat Putsch and a paragraph about the Munich Putsch. There is no need for a conclusion in this question. No need at all. You never need to do one. You just go straight in, but you're linking back to the question throughout. That's why you don't really need to do an additional conclusion as well. Okay, let's read this through together. So the first right-wing rebellion that the Weimar faced between 1919 and 1923 was the Cat Putsch, which started in March 1920. During the Cat Putsch, Wolfgang Kapp and 5,000 Freikorps, which were ex-soldiers, marched on Berlin. The rebels wanted a return of a strong government, similar to that under the Kaiser, and they were angry at Weimar for signing the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, as it declared that the army would reduce to 100,000 men. The government could not call upon the official army to crush the rebellion, as the army had stated that troops don't fire on troops, so they fled Berlin and called for a general strike. The strike lasted for 4 days and cut all supplies in Berlin, including gas and transport. This showed Kapp that he could not control the workers, and he fled, but was captured and arrested. This event was a huge problem for the government, as it highlighted that Ebert's government could not deal with political violence, and this made them look weak. Also, Kapp was the only one arrested. This shows that the judges sympathised with the right-wing ideas and offered more lenient sentences to those political groups. Therefore, other right-wing groups, such as the Nazis, would be influenced to act against the government in the future. Another right-wing rebellion which threatened the stability of the Weimar Republic was the Munich Putsch, led by Hitler and the Nazis in November 1923. Hitler had planned a rebellion in Bavaria with the support of other right-wing politicians, including the governor of Bavaria, Gustav von Kahr. When Kahr hesitated, Hitler and 600 stormtroopers burst into a meeting at a beer hall where Kahr was speaking and forced at gunpoint to declare a rebellion. The next day, the Nazis with General Ludendorff marched on Munich. The Nazis were defeated in a short battle where 16 Nazis were killed, and Hitler was arrested. Hitler was given a lenient sentence of 5 years in prison, of which he only served 9 months. This lenient sentence continued to encourage right-wing groups to act against the government throughout the 1920s. For example, most of the 376 Weimar politicians that were assassinated in the 1920s were carried out by right-wing. Hitler's trial also became a media sensation, and whilst in prison, he wrote his book Mein Kampf. This helped to develop popularity for Hitler, and the Nazis became a national political party. So after reading that, guys, I hope you've kind of picked out that this answer includes quite a lot of detailed and specific knowledge. You can see lots of examples of facts and figures, not things that are in the question. Of course, dates are in there because that's in the question, but things like, 5,000 Freikorps reduced to 100,000 men, even like, for example, just little details about that the strike lasted for 4 days, where it also talks about the fact that it cut transport and gas and things like that. There's lots of little extra details that just show we've got an understanding of the rebellion itself. But what's really important is where we talk about how it links back to the question. In paragraph 1, it was done with quite a simple sentence starter. This event was a huge problem for the government, as it highlighted, and then it basically gives you 2 different reasons for why the stability of Weimar was affected by this rebellion. The second paragraph also similarly has lots of specific facts and figures. Again, look, we've got facts and figures going on here. Talk about 16 Nazis being killed, that's another one. So we've got lots of detail in here again. And on this one, again, I have given 2 reasons for why it affected the stability. I haven't necessarily started with the same sentence starter, but I have just basically turned the knowledge into explanation by talking about, for example, the fact that Hitler had a lenient sentence of 5 years in prison. And then I've talked about how the fact this continued to encourage right-wing groups to act. And I've also talked about the politicians being assassinated. But then I've also said that Hitler's trial also became a media sensation. And this also helped him to become a national political party. Now, again, sentence starters are really helpful because, for example, saying this event was a huge problem for the government because really helps you to make sure that you are linking back to the question. And it also shows the examiner that you are doing that. But even if you don't use that sentence starter, but you are still explaining why it affected stability, that's just as good, okay? But I'm just trying to show you some different ways that you can go about writing that up. But ultimately, what I'm trying to suggest, guys, that you must make sure that you are linking back to why it was a problem for the Weimar government, and you're not just describing the rebellion itself. Let's move on to look at an example on your own. Okay, so here's our question 5, example 2. This is the one I'd like you to have a go at doing on your own. You've now seen an example in the example 1, and you've seen an example of a model answer as well. So now hopefully you can use that to have a go at this question yourself. The question is, in what ways was Stresemann able to improve the state of the German economy? So you can only focus on the German economy, nothing else that Stresemann improved. So you can't be talking about like foreign policy agreements and things like that. So what would your paragraphs be about? Again, I'm going to ask you just to pause the video for a second, just so you can have a think about what your paragraphs would be on your own before you look at the answers. Okay, so let's have a look at what I would do my paragraphs on. You can go differently, but this is what I think would make a good answer. I think paragraph 1 needs to be talking about how Stresemann stabilised hyperinflation. An example of that could be using Rentenmark, but there are other things you could talk about as well, about how he improved the economy generally and tried to stabilise the currency after hyperinflation in 1923. The second paragraph, I would talk about how he improved the situation with reparations, and I would talk about the fact that the Dawes and Young plans were really important in helping Germany to pay those off. So essentially, guys, you've got to show that you've got an understanding of what the problems were in the German economy from 1923. So particularly hyperinflation and reparations are key problems. And what we're talking about is how he improved those problems. So, you can show some understanding in this answer of what the problem was to begin with. And then you can talk about how far he was able to improve the state of the economy by using these examples to help you. So I hope that's given you a bit of a head start. But I'd like you now to pause this video and have a go at writing up this answer on your own. Remember, it should really take you much more than 10 minutes. So have a go and make sure again that you do hand in your answer to your teacher for marking. Well done for making it to the end of the lesson, Year 11. I just wanted to finish off by reminding you to send in your answers to your teachers. It is really important, and I've said this many times, that getting feedback from your teachers will really help us to see how well you're understanding the knowledge, but also it will help you to keep progressing in the subject, and that's what's really important. So make sure that you do send in your answers so that you can get some feedback. And obviously you can feel free to do dirt if you'd like to as well. But even if you don't, at least you know where you went wrong and how you could keep improving your answers. So please do send them in. Ask your teacher on Teams for their email, or you can actually send these in through Show My Homework, even on a flexible task, but you just need to click on discussion to do that. Thank you for listening, Year 11, and take care.